When I think back to how everything started, it seems like another life. My name is Anna, and my dad was the kind of politician you'd hear about in the news, a big shot, well-respected, involved in everything. People expected me to follow in his footsteps, but I fell in love with art instead. The Museum of Fine Arts wasn't just my workplace, it was my sanctuary. I was 25 when I first met Charles. He was part of my father's inner circle, always around at those endless political gatherings I had to attend. He was smooth, knew exactly what to say and when. One evening, he cornered me by the buffet table at some fundraiser, a glass of cheap wine in his hand. "Anna, right? I've seen you around, but we've never really talked," he said, flashing a rehearsed smile. "Yeah, that's right. Busy with the artifacts, not much time for chit-chat," I replied, trying to keep it light but direct. Charles laughed. "I get it. But you know, it's not just artifacts that need preserving. Connections do too. Maybe we could grab a coffee, talk about how the campaign's going?" It was so cliché, yet somehow he made it sound genuine. "Sure, why not? But if you're trying to get a donation out of me, you'd better bring more than just coffee," I teased. He grinned. "It's a deal. How's Friday?" From there, things moved fast. Coffee turned into dinners turned into weekends away, and before I knew it, 2 years had passed and we were standing at the altar. My parents were thrilled. Charles had become an essential part of my dad's team by then, his career on a sharp upward trajectory. Our wedding was more of a political event than a personal celebration. I stood there in a dress far too extravagant, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, the perfect politician's daughter. After the wedding, Charles and I moved into the house my parents gave us as a wedding gift. It was large, probably too large for just the two of us, in one of those neighborhoods where every house hides behind big gates and even bigger stories. "Anna, this place is perfect," Charles said as we walked through our new home. His eyes were already on some imaginary future where he was more than just an aide in my father's team. "Just think of the parties we can throw, the people we'll host. This is just the beginning." "Yeah, the beginning," I echoed, but my mind was elsewhere. I was wondering how long I could keep working at the museum now that I was Mrs. Charles Westmore. Charles seemed to read my thoughts. "Look, Anna, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time you considered stepping back from the museum. We're going to start a family soon, right? You won't want to split your time." His words hit me harder than expected. "But the museum is my life, Charles. I'm not sure I'm ready to give that up." He wrapped his arms around me, his voice soothing but firm. "It's about what's best for our family. Trust me, this will be good for us. Good for you." I wanted to protest, to argue that my job was part of who I was. But looking into his confident face, I nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll see how it goes." Adjusting to married life wasn't easy, especially with the changes Charles pushed so soon after our honeymoon. His career had taken off like a rocket, and he was barely ever home, always at some meeting or another, always scheming for the next big opportunity. One evening, Charles came home later than usual, his face all lit up with excitement. He barely said hello before launching into his news. "Anna, you won't believe the kind of day I've had. Meetings back to back, but babe, it's all paying off. I'm telling you, this is our time." "Our time?" I echoed, half amused, half exasperated. "I hardly see you anymore, Charles. And when you are here, it's like you're not really here." He shrugged off his coat and grabbed a beer from the fridge. I know, it's been crazy. But this is what we worked for, right? Once I secure this next promotion, things will slow down. We can start thinking about that family we talked about." Family. The word hung between us, heavy and daunting. "Yeah, about that." I began hesitantly. "I've been thinking maybe I could go back to the museum, part-time at least. I miss it, Charles. I miss feeling like I'm part of something." Charles's face hardened a bit. He set down his beer, looking me straight in the eye. "Anna, we've been over this. You going back to work doesn't make sense right now. We're at a critical point. You need to be available, for whatever comes up. Available for what, Charles? Parties? Fundraisers? I need something more than just being your plus one. He sighed, running his hands through his hair. Look, I get that you're bored. But think about the long game. My career is on the rise, and when the time comes, you'll be glad we did things this way. Life settled into a predictable routine. Charles, always busy, always moving forward, and me, trying to find my footing in a life I hadn't planned. When I found out I was pregnant, part of me was overjoyed, thinking maybe this baby would bridge the gap growing between us. The day I told Charles, he was as excited as I'd seen him since our wedding day. A baby, Anna? Really? This is fantastic. He swept me up in his arms, spinning me around before setting me down gently, mindful of the life we were about to bring into the world. Yes, really, I laughed, the sound more relieved than anything. Looks like you're going to be a father, Mr. Westmore. We're going to be great at this, you'll see. And hey, maybe after the baby's born, you'll see things differently. This house, this life, it'll all make sense then. When our daughter Sophie was born, my parents were over the moon. They showered her with all kinds of gifts, from plush toys to savings bonds. Dad, especially proud, would often look at Charles and nod approvingly, saying, "You're doing a fine job, son." He trusted Charles so much that he even handed over the financial reins of his upcoming election campaign to him. "I can't think of a better man for the job," Dad said, clapping Charles on the back. It felt good to see them bond, but deep down, something nagged at me. The day my parents died in that plane crash was the day part of me died too. For the last 15 years since marrying Charles, aside from raising our daughter Sophie, I'd poured my soul into charity work. It gave me a purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning with Charles always buried in his career. But after the accident, everything just felt hollow. The morning I found out, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. I ignored it until Charles stormed into the kitchen, phone in hand, looking like he'd seen a ghost. It was Uncle Ted, Dad's brother, his voice shaking, struggling to get the words out. "Anna, there's been an accident. Your parents, their plane crashed shortly after takeoff. They didn't make it." The days that followed were a blur. Our home became a command center, with Charles and Dad's staff buzzing around, organizing what would be a massive funeral. Everyone loved Dad, politicians, locals, everyone. The city was in mourning, their beloved leader gone too soon. I barely remember the funeral. The grief was too much, and the sedatives the doctor gave me made everything fuzzy. I just remember holding Sophie's hand the whole time, her presence my only anchor to the moment. She was so strong, despite being just a teenager. She stayed close, squeezing my hand whenever she felt me shaking. After the ceremony, Charles shuffled over with a stack of papers. He looked everywhere but at me. "These need your signature. It's to close out your father's campaign accounts," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. My mind was too foggy to question it. I should have, I know that now. But all I could do was nod and sign where he pointed, trusting him like I always had. In the weeks that followed, Charles was barely around. He'd leave early, come back late, and all his words felt empty. "Just tying up loose ends with the campaign," he'd say. But it felt like more than that. It felt like he was slipping away too. The shift in Charles was sudden and drastic, almost as if the man I married had been swapped with a stranger overnight. Just days after my father's funeral, which Charles had organized meticulously, he buried himself in his work, spending long hours locked away in his office at home, completely shutting me and Sophie out. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. "He's grieving too, in his own way," I told myself, thinking maybe the loss of my father, his mentor, was hitting him harder than he let on. But as weeks turned into months, his detachment only deepened. 2 months after the funeral, Charles was hardly ever home, and when he was, it felt like he was a ghost passing through our lives. His weekends were spent at the office, and every conversation about his whereabouts ended in vague assurances. Then came the cuts. Without any real discussion, Charles fired our housekeeper and driver. "We need to tighten our belts," he declared one evening out of the blue, his tone cold and final. I stood in the kitchen, stunned and confused. "But why? We've never lived extravagantly," I argued, trying to understand his sudden frugality. Charles's response was sharp, his patience thin. "Things are changing, Anna. We can't live like your father is still here to bail us out. You'll need to start doing more around here." The reality of daily chores and school runs fell on my shoulders. He even went as far as to control how I spent on personal care, allowing me styling and manicures only if I had to appear in public by his side, which became increasingly rare. His control over our finances tightened further. "You need to check with me before you buy anything," he insisted one evening, his eyes hard as he blocked the TV with his stance. I couldn't hide my shock and anger. "I've always been careful with money, Charles. Why are you treating me like a child?" I demanded, my voice rising in frustration. "This is how it has to be now," he snapped, his tone harsh. "Your father's era is over, Anna. You're going to live how you deserve." His words felt like a slap. I stared at him, trying to reconcile this cruel man with the Charles I thought I knew. Before I could respond, our argument was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Sophie, looking scared and confused, had come into the living room. "Mom, what's going on?" she asked, her voice small. I wanted to protect her, to shield her from this ugliness. "It's nothing, honey. We'll sort it out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But Charles wasn't done. His voice grew louder, his words more cutting. "Don't lie to her, Anna. She should know that her mother is nothing but a leech, living off her father's success." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at Sophie, her presence making the blows land even harder. "Charles, please, not in front of Sophie." But he ignored me, turning his venom towards both of us. "Neither of you matter. You're both nothing, just bumps in the road. Remember that." With that, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him, leaving me and Sophie in a stunned silence. I stood in the living room, tears streaming down my face. The harsh words echoed in my ears, piercing deep. I felt broken, but as I stood there, something within me stirred, a resolve, a determination that I hadn't felt in a long time. I'm my father's daughter, after all, and he never backed down from a challenge. He taught me to stand up for myself, to fight for what's right, no matter how tough the battle might seem. I wiped the tears from my cheeks and turned to Sophie, who had witnessed everything. Her face was crumpled with worry, her eyes wide with fear. "Hey, it's going to be okay," I said, hugging her tightly. "We're strong, you and I. We can handle this together." Sophie nodded, wrapping her arms around me. "I want to help, Mom. I don't like seeing you sad." I smiled, squeezing her hand. "And you are a big help, sweetheart. We're in this together." The house was silent after that, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos of the confrontation. With a newfound determination, I made my way to Charles's office, the place he kept all his secrets. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I needed to find something, anything that could help me understand the depth of his deceit. I found the keys to his desk after a few frantic minutes of searching and began to sift through his drawers. Papers, files, receipts, and then a small, inconspicuous flash drive tucked away beneath a stack of old campaign flyers. My hand shook as I plugged it into the computer. The contents were a gut punch, photos, intimate movies starring Charles and various women. My heart raced, anger and betrayal swirling into a nauseating mix. I didn't confront Charles. Instead, I called George, an old family friend and my father's trusted attorney, before he retired. "George, I need to see you. It's urgent," I managed to say, my voice steady, despite the turmoil inside. "Come over, Anna. I'm here for you," he responded, his voice a comforting anchor in the storm. The next day, I met with George at his home. I showed him the flash drive, and his face hardened as he sifted through the files. "I suspected as much," George said, his voice low. "I'm sorry to say this, but Charles only married you because of your father's influence." Hearing someone else say it out loud was both a relief and a fresh wave of pain. "What do I do, George? I can't let Sophie grow up thinking this is what marriage looks like." George set his jaw, his old friend's loyalty firm and unwavering. "You'll divorce him. I'll come out of retirement to see this through. For you, and for the memory of your father. We'll start gathering evidence, build a case." After our meeting, I returned home, feeling a mix of fear and courage. I sat down with Sophie, taking her hands in mine. "We're going to make some changes, honey. It's going to be tough for a while, but we're doing this to build a better life, a happier one." Sophie squeezed my hands, her young face set with determination. "I'm with you, Mom. All the way." As I prepared for bed that night, the reality of the situation settled in. I was about to go up against the man I had once loved, the father of my child. But I was not alone. I had Sophie, and I had George. A month after the devastating revelation, I found myself sitting in the living room of George's house again. He'd taken it upon himself to dig deeper into Charles's affairs, hiring the best detectives he could find. As we sat together, the detectives laid out their findings, and each piece of information was a heavier blow than the last. "Anna, we found evidence of multiple affairs," one of the detectives began, his tone somber. "It seems Charles has been leading a double life for quite some time." I felt a sick twist in my stomach, but it was the next piece of information that truly stunned me. "More critically," the detective continued, "we've uncovered significant financial discrepancies. Charles embezzled over $1 million from your father's accounts. He also took advantage of the power of attorney you signed during your father's funeral to transfer all property titles to his name. He's put your house on the market already." I sat there, frozen, trying to process the betrayal. The room felt like it was spinning. "He did what?" My voice was a whisper, barely audible. George placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Anna. We've also traced the money from your father's accounts to several personal accounts of Charles. He's been planning this for a long time." The betrayal was so profound, so complete, it was almost paralyzing. I had lived with this man, trusted him with everything, and in return, he had robbed me, not just of my money, but of my trust and years of my life. As the detectives packed up their files and left, George turned to me with a stern expression. "Anna, it's not safe for you and Sophie to stay at your house anymore. He's desperate, and there's no telling what he might do next. You should move in here for the time being." That evening, Sophie and I quietly packed our most essential belongings. It felt surreal, almost like we were fugitives in our own life. Sophie, sensing the seriousness, was unusually quiet. We left the house with just a few bags, the shadows of the evening cloaking our departure. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the home I had loved, a place that now felt tainted with betrayal. Later that night, after we had settled into George's guest rooms, my phone rang. It was Charles. His voice was icy when he realized I wasn't at home. "Where are you, Anna? What do you think you're doing?" I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves before responding. "I know everything, Charles. The affairs, the theft, all of it. We'll see each other in court." His barrage of insults began, a vile stream meant to wound. But I didn't stay on the line to listen. I hung up, my finger trembling slightly as I ended the call. Turning off the phone, I looked over at Sophie, who was watching me with wide eyes. "It's going to get tougher before it gets better," I said, trying to prepare her, and myself, for what was to come. As soon as George and I handed over the damning evidence to the police, things started to move at a breakneck speed. We also filed the necessary documents for the divorce, and with every step, I felt a mix of dread and determination. One evening, as I was reviewing some files George had left me, my phone rang. It was Charles. His voice was icy, laced with anger and threat. "You're going to regret this, Anna. You have no idea what you've just started. I held the phone slightly away from my ear, his threats echoing in the quiet of the room. Remembering George's advice, I had started recording the call, knowing that any evidence of his intimidation could be crucial. I think you're the one who's going to regret it, Charles, I replied calmly, though my hand trembled slightly. Everything you've done is coming to light. After ending the call, I played back the recording, my heart sinking with each word. But there was also a surge of relief. Now I had more than just financial deceit, I had evidence of his attempts to intimidate me. I contacted the police immediately, and they took the recording seriously. Within days, Charles was arrested. The charges were severe: tax and bank fraud, embezzlement, and now threats against me. The court denied him bail, citing the gravity of his crimes and his potential for flight. His assets were frozen, leaving him unable to wield the financial influence he'd held over me for so long. The trial was grueling. Sitting in the courtroom, listening to all he had done, recounted like a list of transactions, was both vindicating and painful. But when the judge finally sentenced Charles to 25 years in prison and banned him from ever holding public office again, a heavy weight lifted off my shoulders. Following the trial, the divorce proceedings were straightforward. The judge awarded me the divorce, full custody of our daughter, and a significant portion of our assets, including the return of my parents' property. Additionally, Charles was ordered to pay $500,000 in compensation for his betrayal and the threats against me. As I drove home, the realization that it was truly over began to sink in. I was free from Charles's manipulation, free to start anew. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake, worrying about the future, and felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. At home, I found Sophie in the kitchen, making us a celebratory dinner. She rushed over and hugged me tightly. "Mom, you're really okay now, right?" "Yes, sweetheart, I am. It's all over," I assured her, holding her close. "We can finally move on." Life after the storm of the trial and Charles's sentencing settled into a calm I hadn't felt in years. Sophie and I had moved to a small coastal town where the sea seemed to offer a daily reminder of renewal and endless possibilities. We bought a cozy house with a view of the ocean, a place where each morning greeted us with the sound of waves, a stark contrast to the chaos of our past lives. I returned to my first love, art, taking a job at a local gallery. The work was invigorating, allowing me to connect with artists and patrons, curating pieces that sparked conversations and emotions. One evening, after a gallery opening that had gone particularly well, Sophie and I sat on our porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Sophie, now almost done with high school, was applying to colleges, her eyes set on studying environmental science. "Mom, do you ever miss our old life?" Sophie asked, her voice thoughtful as she sipped her tea. I paused, considering her question. "Not really," I finally said. "I mean, I miss the people we left behind, our friends, but not the life with your father. This," I gestured around us to the quiet street, the fading light. "This is better, don't you think?" "Yeah, I do," Sophie smiled. "I like it here, the quiet, the sea, it's like we can just be ourselves. That's all I ever wanted for us, to be somewhere we could just be happy and free," I replied, feeling a swell of contentment. "And we are, aren't we? Happy and free?" she asked, looking at me with those clear, wise eyes that reminded me so much of her grandmother. "We really are," I confirmed, my heart full. As the weeks rolled into months, our new life took shape. I found joy not just at work, but in the small moments: morning walks on the beach, coffee with neighbors, quiet evenings with Sophie. We were building a community, forming friendships based on who we were, not who we were expected to be. As summer turned to fall, and the air grew crisp with the scent of salt and pine, Sophie received her college acceptance letters. The day they arrived, she tore them open with a mixture of excitement and nerves. "Mom, I got in. I got into my top choice," she exclaimed, waving the letter in the air. I hugged her tightly, both of us laughing and crying. "I knew you would. I'm so proud of you, Sophie." As I watched her talk about her future, her hopes, and her dreams, I realized how far we'd come. We were no longer defined by the shadows of our past, but by the light of our future. Starting over hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every challenge, every fear. Here, in this little town by the sea, Sophie and I had found more than just a new home. We had found a new life, one filled with hope, art, and endless possibilities.